The rain came sideways across the moor, and Nell counted the steps between the road and the iron gates because counting was better than screaming. 47 steps through mud that sucked at her boots. Rosie pressed her face into Nell's neck, the girl's breath warm and damp against her skin, and Nell's arms burned from carrying her the last half-mile. The house was wrong. That was the first thing. The advertisement had said, "Modest household in the village of Ashwick, seeking a capable woman for domestic management." Nothing about this was modest. The building rose 3 stories against the grey sky, its limestone facade streaked dark with rain, its windows shuttered except one. A single gold square of light on the ground floor, like a candle left burning in a room where someone had forgotten to die.
"Mama,"
Rosie said, her voice muffled against Nell's collar.
"I'm cold."
"I know, love. Count the windows with me."
"I don't want to count windows."
"Then count how many seconds until Mama finds us somewhere warm." She shifted Rosie higher on her hip and walked toward the door. The gravel drive was choked with weeds. A stone urn lay on its side near the entrance, spilling dried soil like a wound. The brass knocker was tarnished to near black, shaped like a lion's head, with its mouth open in a snarl. Nell grabbed it and knocked 3 times, hard enough to make her wrist ache. Nothing. She knocked again. The rain ran down the back of her cloak, cold as creek water, finding the gap between her collar and her neck. Rosie whimpered. "Right," Nell muttered. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The entrance hall was vast and dark and smelled of cold stone and old smoke. A staircase climbed into shadow. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dulled with dust. The only light came from a doorway to the left, that single gold glow she had seen from outside, spilling across the marble floor like something that had escaped. Nell stepped inside. Her boots left mud prints on the white stone, and she did not apologize for them. "Who the devil are you?" The voice came from the lit doorway. A man stepped through it, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair falling across his forehead as if he had not looked in a mirror in some time. His shirt was untucked, his jaw was unshaved. His eyes, even in the dim light, were the color of January ice, and they fixed on Nell with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something that lived between the two.
"I might ask you the same question,"
Nell said, "but my daughter is shivering, and my patient's left somewhere around mile 3. You have the wrong house." "I have this address." She pulled the letter from her cloak pocket with her free hand, the paper soft with rain. "Ashwick Hall, domestic management position. I was told to arrive by evening." He stared at the letter. Something moved across his face. Recognition, confusion. Something darker that closed like a shutter before she could name it. "There is no position." "Then your solicitor is a liar, and you have a larger problem than a woman on your doorstep." Rosie lifted her head and looked at the man with the devastating directness of a 4-year-old. "We walked in the rain," she announced, "for a very long time. Mama said a word she told me never to say." The man's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one that this room had seen in a while. "Come in," he said, and his voice had shifted, still rough, still unwelcoming, but no longer a wall. "Before the child catches her death." He turned and walked back through the lit doorway without waiting to see if she followed. Nell followed. She always did the thing people did not expect her to do, and in that moment, the unexpected thing was obedience. The room was a kitchen, enormous, with a vaulted ceiling and a hearth wide enough to roast an ox. But the hearth was cold. The long oak table held a single plate, a single glass, a single candle. The air smelled of tallow and abandonment. No bread, no herbs, no evidence that anyone had cooked in this room in months. Nell set Rosie on the table. The girl sat with her legs dangling, watching everything with her mother's sharp brown eyes, and walked to the hearth. Kindling was stacked beside it, untouched. She pulled her flint from her pocket. "What are you doing?" the man said. "Lighting a fire. Unless you'd prefer we freeze decoratively." "You can't simply—" The kindling caught. Mel blew on it, gentle and precise, and flame climbed through the sticks like something that had been waiting for permission. She added 2 logs from the basket. The fire took, crackling and orange, and warmth bloomed into the stone room like a held breath finally released. She turned around. The man was staring at her with an expression she could not quite decode. His hands were at his sides, fingers curled loosely, as if he had been about to reach for something and changed his mind. "I'm Mel Ashford," she said. "This is Rosie. If there's no position, we'll leave in the morning. But tonight, my daughter needs a bed and a warm meal. And I suspect you haven't had one of those in some time either." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Harcourt," he said finally. "James Harcourt." "The Duke of Ashwick?" "If you like." "I don't particularly, but I'll manage." A sound came from beneath the table, a small, deliberate sound, like a mouse that had decided to announce itself. Rosie leaned over the edge and peered underneath. "There's a boy under here," she said, with the tone of someone reporting a weather condition. "He's got a blanket." Nell looked at James. Something in his face cracked, a fracture line running through whatever composure he had built for the evening. "Thomas," he said quietly. "Come out, please." The boy who emerged was perhaps 5 years old, thin in the way children get when they are eating but not being fed, when the meals are mechanical and joyless. He had James's dark hair and someone else's eyes, wide, grey, full of a wariness that should not have lived in a face that young. He clutched a wool blanket around his shoulders and looked at Nell the way a feral cat looks at an open hand. "Hello, Thomas," Nell said. She crouched so her eyes were level with his. "I'm Nell. That's Rosie. She talks too much and she's very bad at being quiet, but she's quite good at sharing biscuits if you happen to have any." "We don't have biscuits," Rosie said, clearly affronted. "Then we'll have to make some." Nell stood and looked at James. "I assume you have flour?" "I don't—" He stopped, looked at his son, who was looking at Rosie with the first spark of interest Nell had seen cross his face. "There might be flour in the pantry." Nell was already moving. She opened the pantry door and found what she expected: a few tins of tea, a sack of flour that was mostly intact, a jar of preserved plums with dust on the lid, butter that had been left unwrapped. She carried armfuls to the table, working around Rosie's dangling legs, and within 10 minutes, the kitchen smelled of something it had clearly forgotten. Effort. She made drop biscuits, because they required nothing but hands and heat, and while they baked on a flat pan over the fire, she cleaned the table around the Duke's abandoned plate. He stood in the doorway watching her, arms crossed, as if she were an invading army he had not quite decided how to repel. Thomas sat on the bench next to Rosie. He had not spoken, but when Rosie handed him the small carved wooden horse she carried everywhere, the one she refused to let go of, the one that had survived every move, every loss, every night in a cold room, Thomas took it. He held it carefully, the way a child holds something they understand is precious. Nell's chest tightened. She turned back to the fire before the feeling could show on her face. She counted the cracked window panes in the kitchen. 4, while the biscuits browned. She counted the cobwebs in the corners. 7. She counted the distance between herself and the door. 12 steps, in case she needed to leave quickly in the morning, in case this was a mistake, in case the ache in her ribs that said, "stay," was just exhaustion pretending to be instinct. The biscuits were done. She served them on a plate that might have been fine china once, now chipped at the rim. Rosie ate 2. Thomas ate 3, silently, his eyes never leaving Rosie's face. James ate 1, standing, as if sitting down would constitute a concession he was not prepared to make. "I'll show you a room," he said when the plate was empty. His voice was careful, measured, the way people speak when they are trying very hard not to want something. He led them upstairs by candlelight. The hallway was lined with portraits, men in wigs, women in silk, generations of Harcourts staring down from gold frames. Nell kept her eyes forward until one portrait stopped her mid-step. The woman in the painting had dark hair, pinned simply, a face that was handsome rather than beautiful, and eyes that held a quiet intelligence. Nell recognized the way you recognize a voice you have heard through a wall, without seeing the face, but knowing it completely. There was something in the set of her mouth, something in the angle of her chin that said, I knew exactly what I was doing. Your wife? Nell asked. James did not turn around. Catherine. She was lovely. She was better than lovely. His voice was flat, not cold, the flatness of someone who has said the same words too many times and can no longer hear them. She was good. He opened a door at the end of the hall. The room was clean, the only clean room Nell had seen, which meant he had prepared it, which meant he had expected someone, which meant the letter was not the mistake he had claimed it was. She filed this away. She was good at filing things away. Rosie fell asleep in the center of the bed within 3 minutes, still holding a crumb of biscuit in her fist. Nell pulled the quilt over her and stood at the window, looking out at the rain-black grounds. The garden below was a tangle of shadow, but even in the dark, she could see the shape of it. Rose bushes climbing the stone wall, wild and unkempt, their thorns catching the faint light from the kitchen window below. Someone had planted those roses with intention. Someone had let them go. Nell pressed her forehead against the cold glass and counted her heartbeats until they slowed. She woke to silence and grey light and the smell of something burning. The burning turned out to be James attempting toast over the kitchen fire. He stood at the hearth with a long fork and an expression of concentrated defeat, watching bread blacken on the prongs. You're holding it too close, Nell said from the doorway. He did not startle. I'm holding it at the distance I always hold it, which is too close. I am a duke. I'm not accustomed to being corrected about toast. And yet here we are. She crossed the kitchen and took the fork from his hand. Their fingers touched, briefly, accidentally, a collision of skin that lasted half a second and registered somewhere in her body like a bell struck in an empty church. She pulled the fork back from the flame, adjusted the angle, and handed it back. He took it without looking at her. Thomas was at the table, drawing on a piece of paper with a charcoal stub. Rosie sat beside him, narrating his drawing in a running commentary that Thomas appeared to find either fascinating or tolerable. With children, the difference was slim. We'll leave after breakfast, Nell said. She poured water from the pitcher into a pot and set it to boil. If you could point me toward the village, I'll ask at the posting house. Thomas spoke this morning. Nell's hands stilled on the pot. He hasn't spoken, James said, his voice stripped of everything except the fact. Since his mother died. 8 months. The physician said it might never. He stopped, swallowed. This morning he asked your daughter if she wanted to see the horses. Nell looked at Thomas, who was drawing a horse, or something that intended to be a horse in the philosophical sense. Rosie leaned over and added what appeared to be wings. That's not, Thomas began, then pressed his lips together, as if the words had escaped before he had authorized them. It's a flying horse, Rosie said firmly. All the best horses fly. Thomas considered this. Then he drew wings on the next horse, too. Nell turned back to James. He was looking at his son with an expression that hurt to witness. A man seeing sunlight after 8 months of cloud and not quite trusting it to last. Stay, he said. 1 week. I'll pay you a proper wage. I don't need your it isn't charity. His jaw tightened. It's desperation, Mrs. Ashford. I have a child who won't speak, and a house I can't manage, and a staff that left 3 months ago because I forgot to pay them. Stay for a week and tell me what needs fixing, and I'll make sure you leave with enough to reach wherever you're actually going. Nell counted the cracks in the ceiling. 14. She counted the seconds of silence. 7. 2 weeks, she said. And you'll eat your meals at the table, not standing in doorways like a ghost haunting his own house. His eyes widened. Then something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not yet, but the architecture of one. The scaffolding before the building. Agreed. Nell tore through Ashwick Hall the way storms tear through wheat fields, with purpose, without apology, and leaving everything flattened and rearranged in her wake. She started with the kitchen. The larder was restocked from the village by noon. She had marched to the grocer herself, Rosie on her hip, and ordered provisions with the calm authority of a general commissioning rations. By evening, the kitchen smelled of onion soup and fresh bread, and something that might, if you were generous, be called hope. The next morning she attacked the drawing room. She ripped down moth-eaten curtains with her bare hands, raising clouds of dust that made her cough and cough again. She threw open windows that had not been opened in months, and cold, clean air rushed through the house like water through a broken dam. James watched from doorways. He was always in doorways, she noticed, never fully inside a room, never fully outside it, occupying thresholds like a man who had forgotten how to commit to a direction. "You could help," she said, wrestling a curtain rod from its brackets. "I'm supervising." "You're lurking, there's a difference." She yanked. The rod came free, and she staggered backward, catching herself against the wall with one hand. Her sleeve rode up, revealing the thin scar along her forearm from the time she had tried to fix a window latch with a bread knife because she could not afford a locksmith. James's eyes found it and lingered. "Are you always this?" He searched for the word. "Destructive? Efficient? Terrifying? Relentless?" She dropped the curtain rod on the floor. "My husband used to say I was a storm wrapped in an apron. He meant it kindly." She pushed hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "Most of the time." The garden was next. She found the rose wall on her second day, an entire south-facing stone wall covered in climbing roses that had grown wild, their canes thick as her thumb, their thorns catching at her sleeves. Someone had planted them with care. The variety was consistent, the spacing deliberate. But they had not been pruned in at least a year, and the wall was half hidden behind a curtain of tangled green. "Your wife planted these," Nell said, not a question. James stood at the garden gate, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders carrying something heavier than his coat. "Catherine loved roses. She said they were the only flower that demanded you bleed for them." Sensible woman. Nell pulled on leather gloves she had found in the potting shed and began cutting back the dead wood. The thorns snagged her sleeves. She did not care. The work was good, physical, immediate, the kind of effort that left no room for the thoughts that lived in the quiet hours. Cut, strip, pile. Cut, strip, pile. The rhythm was a heartbeat. The roses beneath the overgrowth were healthy, green, waiting. Rosie and Thomas played in the grass behind her, safe in the walled garden, their laughter rising and falling like birdsong. Thomas was talking now, not freely, not easily, but in small sentences that grew a little longer each day. "Rosie, look. That's a worm. Your horse can't fly. It doesn't have proper wings." Rosie corrected his physics with the patience of a saint and the logic of a hurricane. Nell smiled with her back turned so no one would see. And the fourth evening, she was shelving books in the library, because the library was a disaster. Books stacked on chairs and windowsills, and one precarious tower in the corner that reached her shoulder, when she found the carved wooden horse. Not Rosie's horse, a second one. It sat on the mantelpiece behind a row of leather-bound volumes, hidden as if it had been placed there deliberately, and then deliberately forgotten. The same size, the same crude but careful carving, the same nick in the left ear where the knife had slipped. The same horse. Nell's hands went still. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers, and the years folded like paper. 14 years old, sitting in the churchyard grass with a boy who had dark hair, and ice-blue eyes, watching him carve a pair of horses from a piece of fallen oak. "One for you," he had said, pressing the smaller one into her palm. "One for me, so we match." She had kept hers. She had kept it through her father's disgrace, their midnight departure from the village, through London and marriage and widowhood, and all the years of making do. It had been Rosie's toy, since Rosie was old enough to hold it. And this was the other one, the matching half. James. She put the horse back on the mantelpiece with hands that trembled. She stood in the library, where the dust motes turned gold in the last light, and she breathed. And she counted the books on the nearest shelf, 23. And she did not let herself think about what this meant. Not yet. But the next morning, when James came into the kitchen and Rosie was eating porridge, and Thomas was attempting to explain to Rosie why horses could not, in fact, fly. "They're too heavy. It's simple mathematics." And James sat at the table, like she had told him to, in a chair, like a person, not a ghost. Nell watched him pour tea, and noticed that his hands were steady, except when he looked at Rosie's carved horse on the table. Then they shook. He knew. He recognized it. And he said nothing. Nell filed this away too, in the place where she kept things that were too large to examine in daylight. She found the letter on the 9th day. The writing desk in the morning room had been locked, and Nell had picked the lock with a hairpin because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who opened things that were closed and dealt with the consequences after. The desk was Catherine's. She knew it immediately. The handwriting on the envelopes, the dried lavender pressed between sheets of writing paper, the particular organization of a woman who had known exactly where everything was, and exactly when she would no longer be there to find it. The letter was in the center drawer, sealed with red wax, addressed in Catherine's clear, steady hand. "To the woman who will come." Nell broke the seal with her thumbnail. Her heart was a fist against her ribs, and she counted the words on the first line, 9, before she let herself read them. The letter was 3 pages long. Catherine's handwriting was beautiful and precise, and utterly without self-pity. She wrote the way she had lived, apparently, with clarity, with intention, with the quiet authority of someone who had decided exactly what would happen after she was gone. She had known. She had known about Nell, not just as a name, not just as a memory, but as the girl James had loved before Catherine existed in his life. "He told me on our wedding night," Catherine wrote, "not as a confession, as an apology. He said he would be a good husband, and he was. But I could see the shape of what he carried. Not a torch, nothing so dramatic. More like a room he had sealed shut and never entered. I never asked him to open it. That was my choice, and I do not regret it." Catherine had been ill for 2 years before she died. She had used that time the way she used everything, deliberately. She had found Nell through a chain of solicitors and parish records. She had arranged for the letter to be sent 6 months after her death. The advertisement for a domestic position at Ashwick Hall sent to exactly 1 person. "I want Thomas raised by someone who can love without caution," Catherine wrote. "James loves carefully. He will always love carefully. You are the other half of the scale. I saw your record. A woman who fights, who breaks things open, who does not wait to be invited. Thomas needs that. James needs that. I am giving you both to each other because I cannot give you anything else, and because this is the one gift I can leave that matters." The last line, "If you are reading this in my morning room, then you have already picked the lock. I expected nothing less." Nell sat in Catherine's chair with Catherine's letter in her hands, and she did not cry. She pressed her palm flat against the desk, felt the smooth wood grain under her fingers, smelled the ghost of lavender that clung to the paper, and she breathed. 1, 2, 3, until the room stopped spinning. Then she stood, folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went to find James. He was in the stable, brushing down a horse that did not need brushing. The way men tend to things that cannot talk back when they need to avoid things that can. "We need to speak," Nell said. "If this is about the chimney I've already sent for, it's not about the chimney." She pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out. He looked at it the way a man looks at a loaded pistol, with full understanding of what it was, and no desire whatsoever to touch it.
"Catherine wrote this,"
Nell said.
"She left it in her desk. She addressed it to the woman who will come. She meant me."
James took the letter. She watched his eyes move across the first page, watched the color leave his face the way tide leaves sand, slowly, completely, exposing everything beneath. His hand found the stable wall. He held it the way a sailor holds a mast, not for comfort, but against capsizing.
"She planned this," he said.
His voice was barely a voice.
"She arranged for you two. She arranged everything. The solicitor, the advertisement, the timing."
Nell's voice was steady, because if it was not, she would break something, and the only thing within reach was the truth.
"She knew who I was. She knew who I was to you. I didn't know you were Eleanor, from the village, the vicar's daughter. You said your name was Ashford. It is Ashford. I married. I thought you were." He stopped. "I carved you a horse. I know. Rosie has it."
The silence that followed was the loudest thing Nell had ever heard. It filled the stable the way smoke fills a room. Slowly, then all at once, pressing against the walls, making it hard to breathe. James folded the letter with great care. His hands were shaking, but his folds were precise. A man who controlled what he could, when he could not control what mattered. "She was dying," he said, "and she used her last months to find the girl I loved when I was 14. Yes. Because she wanted Thomas to be raised by someone who fights for things. Her word, not mine." James pressed his palms against his eyes. He stood like that for a long time, a man at the intersection of grief and gratitude, unable to move in either direction without betraying the other. "I should be angry," he said from behind his hands. "Are you?" He dropped his hands. His eyes were red but dry. "No, she was right. She was always right. That was the most maddening thing about her." Nell almost smiled.
"I'm beginning to think I would have liked her very much."
"She would have adored you." His voice cracked on the word. "She would have followed you through every room in this house, ripping down curtains." They stood in the stable, with the horse breathing quietly between them, and Catherine's letter folded like a map to a place they had not yet decided to go. And Nell counted the distance between them. 4 feet, no more. And she did not close it. Not yet. But she did not leave either. Lord Pemberton arrived on a Tuesday, in a carriage that was far too polished for the muddy drive, and with a smile that was far too polished for the muddy business he had come to conduct. Nell was in the garden when she heard the wheels on gravel. She set down her pruning shears and wiped her hands on her apron and walked around to the front of the house with the calm, measured pace of a woman who has already decided she does not like someone she has not met. He was tall, fair, dressed in London clothes that announced their cost with every stitch. He stepped down from the carriage with the practiced grace of a man who knew he was being watched and wanted the watching to matter. His eyes found Nell immediately, assessed her apron, her dirt-streaked sleeves, the calluses on her hands, and his smile did not waver, which told her everything she needed to know about its sincerity. "I'm looking for the Duke of Ashwick," he said. "He's inside." "And you are?" "The woman who's going to show you in, if you can manage the steps without muddying your shoes." His smile thinned at the edges. "Charming." James met them in the entrance hall. He stood straighter when he saw Pemberton, an involuntary tightening, like a rope pulled taut. His jaw set. His eyes went flat. "Pemberton," he said. "Harcourt, you look terrible." What do you want? Pemberton adjusted his gloves with deliberate slowness. I want what's best for my cousin's child. Thomas needs proper guardianship, a stable household, a father who... His eyes swept the entrance hall, cataloguing the dust, the disrepair, the cracked urn by the door. Can maintain his own estate. Thomas has a father. Thomas has a recluse who forgot to pay his staff. Pemberton's voice was silk over iron. The courts will see it that way too. I've spoken with the magistrate. The boy deserves to be left alone. Mel watched this exchange from the foot of the stairs, her arms crossed, her weight on her back foot. The posture of a woman preparing to move fast. She knew men like Pemberton. She had met them in solicitors' offices and courtrooms, and the narrow hallways of boarding houses where they came to collect rent from women who had nothing left to collect. They smiled. They used words like deserve and proper and best interest. They took things. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs. Rosie was behind him, holding his hand with the fierce grip of a girl who had decided this boy belonged to her and would not be negotiated with on the subject. Pemberton looked up. Ah, there he is. Thomas, my boy. He's not your boy, Nell said. The words came out before she had authorized them, which was how most of her best words worked. Pemberton turned to her with the slow pivot of a man who was not accustomed to being interrupted by women in aprons. I'm sorry. Who exactly are you? I'm the woman who makes sure that child eats 3 meals a day and sleeps in a clean bed and laughs at least once before sunset. She did not uncross her arms. Who exactly are you? I am Lord Pemberton, Catherine's cousin. Thomas's family. Family visits. You've come with a carriage and a threat. That's not family. That's an eviction notice in a better coat. James made a sound that might have been a cough and might have been a laugh poorly disguised as one. Pemberton's eyes narrowed. I see, he said. You've found yourself a guard dog, Harcourt. I should probably mention, Nell said, her voice light and pleasant, and carrying the particular warmth of a lit fuse, that the last person who called me a dog didn't enjoy how the conversation ended. But please, continue. Pemberton did not continue. He adjusted his gloves again, nodded once to James, and said, You'll hear from my solicitor, with the air of a man who believed solicitors were weapons and had clearly never met Nell's pruning shears. He left. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel, and the sound faded, and the house settled back into its silence like a held breath released. James looked at Nell. She looked at him. Thomas and Rosie descended the stairs, still holding hands, unaware that the world of adults had just drawn a line in the gravel. A guard dog, James said. I've been called worse. At least dogs are loyal. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She uncrossed her arms. Her hands were shaking, but only if you looked closely, and she did not intend for anyone to look closely. That man wants Thomas like a landlord wants a building, for the deed, not the walls. I've seen it before. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Thank you, in a voice that sounded like it hurt to use, the way a key hurts a lock that has not been turned in years. They worked. That was the strange thing. How quickly opposition became partnership. How naturally they fell into the rhythm of two people defending the same ground. James retrieved his ledgers from the study, dusted them off, spread them across the kitchen table. Nell sat across from him and read the accounts with the trained eye of a woman who had balanced household budgets on the edge of nothing for years. You're hemorrhaging money, she said. I'm aware. The roof repairs alone, you've been overcharged by 40%. This builder is either incompetent or stealing from you. Possibly both. Definitely both. She turned a page. And your solicitor, the one Catherine used, is he still retained? Mr. Whitmore, yes. Then we write to him tonight. Pemberton's claim requires evidence of negligence. We make sure there's none to find. James leaned forward on his elbows. The candlelight caught the planes of his face, and Nell noticed, really noticed, the shadows under his eyes, the fine lines at the corners of his mouth, the grey that had begun at his temples like frost on a window. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in one, and was only now beginning to realize he might stop.
"You don't have to do this," he said. "Pemberton is my problem." Pemberton became my problem the moment he looked at Thomas like a line item in a ledger. I don't abandon my problems. It's a character flaw. Ask anyone. She handed him a cup of tea without being asked, which meant she had made it while she was reading, which meant some part of her had been tracking his movements. When he sat, when he shifted, when his cup went empty, without her conscious permission. He noticed. His fingers closed around the cup, and his eyes held hers for a beat longer than tea required. They worked until the candle burned low, and the fire had settled into embers. The children were long asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, in the way old houses are at night. Not silent, but full of small sounds, settling beams and wind in chimney flues, and the particular creak of a building that has been standing so long it speaks its own language. Nell gathered the papers into a stack. Her hand brushed his on the table's surface, and neither of them moved. The touch was a question neither of them answered. Warm skin on warm skin, the backs of their fingers barely meeting, existing in the space between accident and intention, where the most honest things lived. "Good night, Mrs. Ashford," James said, and his voice was rougher than it had been. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, and hers was no steadier. The garden became their country, the neutral ground where neither had to pretend and both could breathe. Mel pruned roses while James cleared the overgrown paths, and they talked the way people talk when they are using their hands, in scattered, honest fragments, without the architecture of performance. "My husband was a clerk," Nell said, cutting a dead cane at the base. "Samuel. He was good and steady, and he made me laugh. And he died of a fever in 3 days. 3 days. I didn't even have time to be frightened before it was over." James pulled a tangle of ivy from the garden wall. "Catherine was ill for 2 years. Slow enough to plan, too slow to accept. I kept thinking the next physician would fix it. I kept thinking. Thinking is the cruelest part. She stopped thinking before I did. She started planning instead." He dropped the ivy on the pile. "I should have planned with her. Instead, I sat in the library and read the same page of a book I can't even name for the better part of a year." Nell looked at him through the lattice of rose canes, thorns between them like a metaphor neither of them needed to name. "Samuel was a good man, and I loved him honestly. But he was not—" She stopped, cut another cane. "He was not what I'd imagined when I was young enough to imagine." "What did you imagine?" She was not going to say, "you." She was not going to say a boy in a churchyard carving horses from oak. She was not going to look at his hands, scarred now and capable, and gripping an armful of ivy, and remember them at 14, gentle on wood, shaping something small and permanent and meant for her. "Someone reckless," she said. "Someone who broke things open." "You are describing yourself." "I know. Isn't that terrible?" He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him. Not the scaffolding of one, not the effort of one, but the thing itself, breaking across his face like dawn breaking over water. And she had to look away because the sight of it did something to the cavity behind her ribs that she was not ready to name. The children appeared at the garden gate. Thomas was carrying a book. Rosie was carrying a worm.
"Mama, look! It's enormous!"
"That's very impressive, love. Thomas, what are you reading?"
"A book about horses."
He held it up.
"Real horses, not the flying kind."
"A reasonable distinction," James said.
"I disagree,"
Rosie said, putting the worm in her pocket. "But you're welcome to your opinion." Nell caught James's eye and saw it there. The thing she had been avoiding. The thing she had been counting around. the thing that lived in the space between 4 feet and 0. Amusement, warmth, an ache that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the present tense. She turned back to the roses and cut until her arms hurt. The evening shifted something. Nell was reading to the children in the library a story about a knight and a dragon that Rosie found insufficiently exciting and Thomas found insufficiently accurate, when she looked up and found James in the doorway. Again, always the doorway. But this time, after a long moment, he stepped inside.
He sat in the chair by the fire. Thomas climbed off the sofa and crossed the room and sat at his father's feet, leaning against his knee, and James's hand came down to rest on his son's head, gently, as if the boy were made of glass, and then less gently, as if he had remembered that children are made of sturdier things than fathers give them credit for. Rosie fell asleep first, her head in Nell's lap. Thomas followed, curled against his father's leg. The fire crackled. The room smelled of old books and wood smoke, and the particular warmth that happens when a cold room has been occupied long enough to forget it was ever empty. "I have to tell you something," James said quietly, so as not to wake the children. "If it's about the chimney, it's about the horse." Nell's hand stilled on Rosie's hair. "I carved 2 when I was 14. His voice was so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "One for the girl I loved, one for myself. I kept mine on the mantelpiece in the library for 20 years. I never moved it. When you arrived, and I saw the one your daughter carries." He stopped. His hand on Thomas's head was very still. "I knew. Not immediately. But I knew before you told me." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was afraid that if I named it, you would leave. And I had only just..." He looked at the fire. "I had only just begun to feel as though the house was inhabited again." Mel counted the books on the shelf behind his head. 23. The same 23 she had counted days ago. Nothing had changed in the room, except everything. "I should probably mention," she said, and her voice was lighter than she felt, "that I'm not very good at leaving places where people need me. It's another character flaw. I'm collecting them." A knock at the front door shattered the silence like a stone through glass. James was on his feet instantly, Thomas stirring against his leg. Nell lifted Rosie, settling the girl against her shoulder, and followed him to the hall. A man stood on the doorstep, thin, officious, carrying a leather case that might as well have had "solicitor" stamped across it in brass. "Lord Pemberton sends his regards," the man said, producing a folded document. "You have 14 days to respond." James took the paper. The man left. The door closed. The hallway was cold again. Mel shifted Rosie to her other hip and read the document over James's shoulder. A petition for guardianship, grounds, negligence, instability, the presence of an unvetted woman of no social standing in the household. "Unvetted," Nell repeated. "He means me. He means to use you. Then he's chosen poorly." She took the document from James's hand. "Because I am very bad at being used, and very good at making people regret the attempt." The days after the petition arrived were sharp-edged and bright, like winter sun on ice. Beautiful to look at, dangerous to walk on. James wrote to Mr. Whitmore. Nell organized the household accounts into something that would withstand scrutiny. She polished the silver, not because it mattered, but because her hands needed to be moving, and silver took a certain amount of controlled violence that suited her mood. Pemberton visited twice more. The first time, he brought his own solicitor, a broad, unsmiling man who measured the rooms with his eyes and wrote in a notebook. Nell served them tea with a smile that could have cut glass, and answered every question about the household with precision that left the solicitor's pen hovering above his page, finding nothing to record. The second time, Pemberton came alone. He found Nell in the kitchen that was now warm and fragrant and alive, the kitchen where bread rose on the counter and herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and 2 children's drawings were pinned to the pantry door,
and he looked at it all as if it were evidence of something he had not anticipated. "You've made yourself comfortable," he said. "I've made a household functional. There's a difference. The courts will see a woman who has insinuated herself into a duke's home for her own advantage." Nell set down the bread knife. She did this slowly, the way you set down a weapon you want the other person to notice. "The courts will see a woman who answered an advertisement, found a motherless child who hadn't spoken in 8 months, and stayed because leaving would have been the cowardly thing to do." She met his eyes. "I don't do cowardly, Lord Pemberton. You should know that by now." Brave or foolish? The line is remarkably thin. "I'll let you know which one it was. After." He left with less polish than he had arrived with. His gloves were on wrong. Mel noticed, and the noticing felt like a small, precise victory. That night, she and James sat in the kitchen after the children were asleep, and the fire was low, and the house was quiet, and the distance between them was no longer 4 feet. It was 2. His chair was angled toward hers, and her feet were bare on the warm stone floor, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his hands were wrapped around a cup she had filled without him asking, because she always knew when his cup was empty, because something in her was calibrated to him in a way she had stopped pretending was not deliberate. "He'll bring the magistrate next," Nell said. "I know. We'll need Catherine's will, the original, not the copy Pemberton's solicitor has been waving around, the original, with the full codicil." "Whitmore has it." "Then we need Whitmore here, in person, before the hearing." James nodded. His eyes were on the fire, but his hand moved, not toward her, not quite, but to the table's surface, where it rested 2 inches from hers. The gap was deliberate. The gap was everything. "Nell," he said, and her name in his mouth was a sound she had not heard in 20 years, and it hit her like a physical thing. A hand on her chest, a door thrown open, cold air rushing in where warmth had been hiding. "Don't," she said, not harshly, almost gently. "Not yet. Not until this is done." "Why?" "Because if you say what I think you're going to say, I'll need to decide what to do about it, and I can't afford to be distracted right now. Pemberton is coming for your son. That comes first." He withdrew his hand, not wounded, something closer to wonder. "You are the most impossible woman I have ever met." "I know. It's my best quality." She stood. "Good night, James." She made it to the door before his voice caught her. "When this is done," he said. "You said not yet. That implies later." She looked back. He was still sitting, his hands around his cup, his eyes holding hers with something that was not patience and not impatience, but the very specific quality of a man who has decided to wait, because the thing he is waiting for is worth the cost. "It implies later," she confirmed. And she left before the count in her head, the count she used to steady herself, the count that kept the world in order, dissolved entirely. Pemberton brought the magistrate on a grey morning that smelled of coming rain. They arrived in separate carriages, Pemberton's gleaming, the magistrate's modest and muddied. The magistrate was a small, careful man named Mr. Hargrove, with spectacles and a leather case, and the demeanour of someone who would prefer to be anywhere else. Pemberton swept into the entrance hall as if he already owned it. James stood at the foot of the stairs in his best coat, which Nell had pressed that morning. His chin was up. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a duke. Not the grieving wraith she had found in a dark kitchen, but the man who held the title, who occupied the space, who would not be moved. Nell stood beside him, not behind, beside. Pemberton began his case in the drawing room, his solicitor producing documents like a conjurer producing rabbits, each one a fresh accusation. Negligence, instability, the unpaid staff, the disrepair. The presence of an unrelated woman of unknown character in the household.
Mrs. Ashford, the magistrate said, looking at Nell over his spectacles. What is your relationship to the Duke of Ashwick?
I was hired as housekeeper, Nell said, through a solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, who managed the late Duchess's affairs. I answered an advertisement, arrived with references, and have been managing the household for the past 3 weeks. The accounts are current, the staff has been rehired, and the child is healthy, clothed, fed, and, for the first time in 8 months, speaking.
References? Pemberton said, his eyebrow rising.
3, from my previous employers in London. I have them here.
She produced them. The magistrate read them with the slow attention of a man who recognized quality. Nell watched Pemberton's jaw tighten. The issue, Pemberton pressed, is not the housekeeper's references. It is the Duke's fitness as a guardian, a man who cannot manage his own estate. The estate is managed, James said. His voice was even. The accounts are in order. The repairs are underway. The staff is employed and paid. If Lord Pemberton has specific concerns, I invite him to present them with evidence rather than implication. The room shifted. The magistrate looked between them, the Duke, who was standing straight, the woman beside him, who was standing straighter, the lord across the table, whose case was softening like wet paper. Pemberton played his final card with the confidence of a man who did not know it was a losing hand. The fact remains that this woman has no standing, no legal connection to the child, and no authority in this house. Her presence is inappropriate, and her influence on the boy is, at best, questionable. James stepped forward. His hand found the back of a chair, and he gripped it, not for support, but to anchor himself, to hold his body in the room when his voice wanted to carry him somewhere else entirely. I intend to marry Mrs. Ashford. The room went very still. Nell's breath left her. Not with a gasp, with a quiet, controlled exit, as if her lungs had decided independently that the air in this room was no longer adequate. She looked at James. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the magistrate, with the fixed intensity of a man who has just detonated something and is watching to see where the pieces land. I have loved this woman since I was 14 years old, he said. His voice was steady and wrecked at the same time, like a building that has survived the storm but shows every mark of the wind. I loved her across 20 years and am married to a woman who was good enough to know it and generous enough to forgive it and brave enough to bring her back to me from beyond the grave. I am done being quiet about it. I am done standing in doorways. I will marry her. She will be Thomas's mother in every way the law can recognize, and Lord Pemberton will have no further ground to stand on. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Nell counted. Then she spoke. If you think, she said, turning to face James with the full force of a woman who has just been handed an explosion she did not authorize, that I am going to swoon and say yes because you finally remembered how to use a complete sentence. He looked at her. His eyes were bright and terrified, and absolutely certain, which was an impossible combination. And yet, Nell crossed the room. 3 steps. She grabbed his lapels, both fists, silk and wool and the warmth of his chest beneath, and she pulled him toward her until their faces were inches apart. I'll marry you, she said. But not because you asked. Because I've decided. She kissed him. In the drawing room, in front of the magistrate and Lord Pemberton and the solicitor with the leather case and the portrait of Catherine on the wall behind them, whose painted eyes, in the shifting light, appeared to be smiling. The kiss was not careful. It was not measured. It was the kind of kiss that burns from both ends, like a door thrown open so hard it breaks the hinges. His hands found her waist and pulled her closer, and her hands stayed on his lapels, and for a count of 7 heartbeats, she counted, she always counted. The world outside this room did not exist.
When she pulled back, the magistrate was cleaning his spectacles with a handkerchief, and Pemberton's face had achieved a shade of white that Nell found deeply satisfying. "Well," the magistrate said, "I believe that addresses the question of domestic stability." "I have further concerns," Pemberton began. "No," Nell said. She reached into her pocket and produced the second letter, the pages she had not shared, the ones Catherine had placed deeper in the desk, the ones that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "You don't." She laid the papers on the table. Catherine's handwriting, Catherine's precision. 3 pages detailing Pemberton's debts, gambling losses at 4 separate establishments, a mortgage on his London property he could not service, a loan from a moneylender that would come due in 6 months. And at the bottom, in Catherine's hand, "My cousin will come for the money. He always comes for the money. Show him this." The magistrate read the pages. His spectacles slid down his nose. He pushed them up. He read them again. "Lord Pemberton," he said, with the slow, measured tone of a man who has found a different case than the one he was brought to hear. "I believe we have a separate matter to discuss." Pemberton's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked at Nell, and in his eyes she saw the particular fury of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated, and she held his gaze until he looked away. He left without his solicitor having to carry him, which Nell considered a mercy. The carriage door slammed. The wheels churned the gravel. The sound faded. James stood in the drawing room with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Nell, and an expression she had never seen on a human face. Relief and terror and love, and the specific bewilderment of a man who has just been kissed by a woman who told him she was marrying him because she decided to. "You had those pages the entire time," he said. "I was waiting for the right moment. You kissed me in front of a magistrate. I should probably mention that I don't have a plan for what happens after this. I very rarely do." She straightened his lapels, which were crushed from where she had grabbed them. "But I'm told that's part of my charm." He caught her hand, held it. Not the accidental brush of fingers on a table, not the almost touch of the kitchen, but a deliberate, full-handed grip that said, "I am not letting go." "You are the most terrifying woman in England," he said. "Only England? I was aiming for the continent." He laughed. It was a broken, beautiful sound, and it filled the drawing room the way light fills a window. Suddenly, completely, as if it had always been waiting on the other side. They married on a Thursday, in the village church, with the vicar reading too fast and Rosie scattering wild flowers down the aisle with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a child who has been given petals and a mission. Thomas stood at his father's side, holding the rings on a cushion, his back straight and his face solemn, and his eyes bright with the particular pride of a boy who has been trusted with something important. Nell wore a dress she had made herself, ivory muslin with a ribbon at the waist, and she walked down the aisle alone, because she had always walked alone, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise on the one day it mattered most. But that is not the story. The story is what came after. 6 months later, the kitchen at Ashwick Hall was a different country. Bread rose on the counter in a bowl that Nell had bought at the village market. Herbs hung from the ceiling beams, thyme, rosemary, lavender that Catherine had planted, and Nell had dried and strung, because some gifts are meant to be carried forward. The table held 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 sets of cutlery laid out by Thomas, who had taken it upon himself to set the table each evening with the geometric precision of a boy who had inherited his mother's love of order. Rose jam cooled in jars on the windowsill, made from the climbing roses along the garden wall, pruned back to health, now blooming so fiercely that the south wall was a cascade of pink and white, and the bees came every morning like parishioners to church. Rosie sat on the floor with a book open on her knees, reading aloud to Thomas, who had graduated from horses to atlases, and was quietly correcting her pronunciation of Mediterranean. "It has 5 syllables, Rosie, not 3. With the weary patience of a 6-year-old, who had accepted that his sister would always speak with more passion than accuracy. The carved wooden horse sat on the kitchen mantelpiece, both of them, side by side, after 20 years, the way they were made to be. James came through the kitchen door with mud on his boots and a smell of rain and cut grass clinging to his coat. He crossed to the stove, dipped a spoon into the rose jam, and tasted it.
Nell swatted his hand.
That hasn't set. It's perfect. It's not set. You are impossible. And you are eating jam meant for the village fair. He kissed her forehead, a quick, domestic press of lips that was somehow more intimate than any grand declaration, because it was the kind of kiss that happened every day, the kind that required no occasion, the kind that existed purely because two people were standing close enough and loved each other enough and had fought hard enough for a kitchen that was warm and a house that was full, and a life that neither of them had planned, but both of them had chosen.
"Papa!" Thomas called from the floor. "Rosie says the Mediterranean has 3 syllables."
It has 5. I know, she won't listen. She never does, James said, and looked at Nell, and his eyes said everything his voice did not need to. That the house was no longer grieving, that the doorways were no longer thresholds, that the roses were blooming, that the children were safe, that the life they had built in this kitchen was the life Catherine had imagined when she sealed that letter and trusted it to time. Nell counted the jars of rose jam on the windowsill. 7. She counted the drawings on the pantry door. 12. She counted the years she had carried a wooden horse in her pocket, waiting without knowing she was waiting. 20. She stopped counting. If this story stirred something in you, that ache of finding your way back to someone you thought you had lost, the courage it takes to walk into a house that is not yours and make it home, then perhaps you understand why I tell these stories by the fire. Because love is not only a feeling, it is a decision. It is a woman who grabs a man's lapels and says, "I have decided." It is a kitchen that was cold and is now full of bread and children and rose jam on the windowsill.